Estuary ecosystems are extinct environments where fresh water mixes between rivers and saltwater in the ocean. Estuary ecosystems are extremely sensitive to environmental changes, including nutrient input from industrial operations, urbanization, and agriculture. More nutrients, especially for the nitrogen, may damage algae and decrease water oxygen levels. This may endanger their life. Estuaries provide a variety of fish and other organism communities because the environments are supported by the phytoplankton. The diverse ecosystem supports plants and species to adapt to climatic conditions. Estuaries sustain complex food webs with variety tropical levels. They contribute to biodiversity, provide crucial breeding sites for fish and shellfish species with significant commercial value, and offer virtual ecosystem services.
Well, there's a number of ways that you can group microplastics into different categories. One of the ways is just purely by size. Like microplastics, when you define them, you typically go between 1 micron to 5 millimeters as a size range. In the past, that was sort of debated. Some papers were going lower, some papers were going more narrow, but that's typically the way that we define microplastics. And from there, you can look between aspect ratios for different shapes of particles. So some microplastics are more spherical, some are fragments with irregular shapes, and then others are more like fiber-like materials.
Estuaries get hit hard by microplastic pollution from all sorts of places, think runoff, fishing, sewage plants, shipping, plastic factories, and trash vital salt, especially single-use plastic. This mess doesn't just float around, it sinks with sediment onto shorelines or the seabed, thanks to stuff that is white or sticking together with other gunk.
Most of the microplastics that are entering the environment have a density associated with them that are more dense than water. So you would expect their ultimate fate to be sinking. We do expect to see a lot of microplastic particles in the sediments. There are a few people in my lab that have, from other groups, looked at sediment samples, and they just keep telling me, like, Lauren, you can't wait to play with these samples.
Now these estuaries are like daycare center for the tons of fish. They've got everything little fish need: food and clean waters. And because they are so great, humans have built all sort of stuff nearby, like fish farms, sewage plants, dogs, and horses. But that also means more plastic is ending up in this place, thanks to our growing economy and all the plastic that it turned out. So our estuaries are kind of joining plastic, and that's bad news for the environment and us.
So from what I've seen for zooplankton papers, they're finding that about 1 in 10 to 1 in 50 or so individuals of that given species have 1 microfiber ingested. That's about the scale that they're seeing, and it's really kind of a question that's still being answered, whether or not that is going to be causing a negative effect on zooplankton. If you purely look at the physical effect, like having a particle of that size and shape ingested by these smaller zooplankton, I think it's kind of debatable if they would be causing a substantial effect, just purely because you don't just have microplastic particles in the water. For every microplastic particle in the water, there's multiple orders of magnitude more lithogenic particles in the water. And so if you're worried about these microplastic particles causing a suffocation to zooplankton and things, I think that's a little unreasonable because they're swimming in the water or drifting in the water, surrounded by particles all the time on relatively the same scale in terms of size.
Although there don't seem to be many harmful direct effects of microplastics on marine organisms, there are some indirect effects we need to be aware of. In some studies, they have found that the ingestion of microplastics can disrupt normal behaviors such as breeding and feeding. Probably the biggest concern, however, are the chemicals associated with microplastics. Whether these chemicals come from the manufacturing process or are sorbed onto the microplastics in the sediment, they can be dangerous for marine organisms when they ingest them.
There's another question of whether or not it's these particles that are causing the problems or potentially causing problems to organisms, or if it's just the chemicals associated with these organisms. I'm sure you're familiar with like BPA being an issue in the past. BPA might be gone. Most plastics say BPA free. That doesn't mean that there's no problem, because if they're not using BPA, they're using like BPB or BPF or BPS. Pretty much the same function. And even if you ignore the BPA, there's all of these other UV stabilizers, all of these different antimicrobial agents that are heavy metals. Like, there are so many different additives on these plastics. So this material, PLA, it's touted as this biodegradable, the solution to plastics. You know, we don't have to worry about it staying in the environment for forever, but that's not totally true, because PLA in its 100% purity will degrade readily. In fact, if you go to a chemistry lab that has PLA material and they set it on the countertop or they set it on a desk or something, it'll literally be disappeared in 2 weeks. Like, that's how fast it degrades. But this material is PLA, and I've had this for over a year. I've had a kilogram of it for over a year. It's pretty much still a kilogram, because it's not PLA. In order for you to sell plastics to consumers, it needs to be stable enough to basically sit in a warehouse for years, which means PLA that you're actually buying as a consumer is not the true PLA. It's being stabilized with different things like polyurethane, all sorts of different UV cutters, so it's really not degradable anymore. Because the truth is that any degradable plastic is not going to be fit for consumers, because we cannot rely on the durability of the material. In order to really have an assessment of microplastics are affecting wildlife, you need to know so much about how to quantify these particles properly and what additives are on these particles and how each of these additives would affect different organisms of the food chain, and whether or not these particles are even bleaching, and under what conditions are they leaching. Like, it's all just so much knowledge that needs to be gathered before we can say for sure. So I really wouldn't say for sure, and I think most people really wouldn't either. But there's certainly a potential, because we know they're in the environment. We know that they do carry chemicals that are additives to them that are toxic, and we know that organisms are eating them. And we have found microplastics in organisms pretty much every level of the food chain, other than like the single-celled organisms.
First, to decrease the entry of microplastics into the aquatic environment, we need to identify the original sources and types of microplastics that are entering the marine environment. Creating public awareness is also a great way to combat this. Awareness through education in the public, private, and government sectors will go a long way to raise awareness about microplastics.
Minimizing the effects would really be just minimizing the input to the marine environment. So obviously that means just reducing your use of plastic that's not necessary. Fast fashion is another thing can be, a little bit controversial. I personally don't know how I feel about fast fashion, just because most people, especially in today's world, can really only afford fast fashion. Their entire wardrobe is fast fashion. But that being said, just looking for, a conscious effort from consumers to buy material that is perhaps more durable, or going to, a secondhand store, because studies have shown that older textile materials shed less microplastics than newer material. Another thing is that when you're, washing your clothing in the washing machine, believe it or not, something as simple as cold water reduces shedding. Like, something so simple can reduce shedding by an order of magnitude.
There are also measures to reduce the loss of pre-production pellets, such as installing filters at drains or immediately cleaning spilled pellets. Both voluntary and mandatory measures in industries are of importance to reduce the losses of microplastics. Plastic degrading species are also capable of removing microplastics from wastewater or sludge. They can also be used to improve retention efficiency. Research is being tested on bacteria which have properties that could degrade marine microplastics. Such bacteria could then be applied in the remediation of contaminated environments. This process is natural and very cost efficient. Stormwater runoffs may also contain high quantities of plastics. In these cases, reduction is dependent on the use of alternative degradable materials, improving urban cleaning services, and installing meshes, booms, or separators on drains.
So like historically, people have been throwing plastic in composts, like commercial compost systems, for a long time. So compost is a huge environment that is full of microbes, very diverse, and also has a habit of having a lot of plastic in it. And so there were researchers from, a few decades ago that took compost sample, extracted the DNA, and then did this functional screening to determine if these microbes have plastic degrading capacity, and they did. So could it be escalated to a larger scale? Possibly in the future.
Salt marshes play a critical role in the aquatic food web, supporting a diverse array of life. Beyond the ecological importance, they offer significant protection to coastal communities. By absorbing the influx of water during storm surges, salt marshes act as natural buffers against coastal flooding. Additionally, they also play a crucial role in environmental preservation and pollution mitigation. Salt marshes excel in stabilizing sediments, acting as biofilters for industrial pollutants and trapping of microplastics. The vegetative roughness from Spartina plants and algae biogenic roughness are the key in reducing the transportation of microplastics to the ocean. Resident burrowing crabs promoted the burial, release, and transport of microplastics. Salt marshes not only act as a microplastic sink, but they are also a source of microplastic to the ocean in the event of a strong wave. So we are in need for effective management and cleanup of large plastic debris to mitigate marine microplastic pollution. However, these salt marshes ecosystem face vulnerabilities from climate change and sea level rise.